You just give another.
There we go. Okay, here come some folks now. Welcome, everybody. My name is Nick Hool. I'll be kind of being the MC for today's conversation between Gary Schoniger and Steve Mariotti. Steve, I said that last name right, correct?
Yes, yes, you did. Thank you.
Good. So we'll just wait another minute or two to let everyone who's going to be joining us at the beginning of this come in. But a few things about today's conversation. We'll be talking for 45 minutes, somewhat interrupted. Gary and I will be talking with Steve about his journey in entrepreneurship education, and then we'll be bringing other folks in for questions. So if you have any questions for Steve, Gary, or myself, you can put those in the chat function, which you'll find along the bottom of the Zoom window, or the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring both of those. And like I said, we'll be answering those live. If there's plenty of questions, we'll take the ones that we can. But also to kind of get things started, if you wouldn't mind putting your name, where you're calling in from, and what you're excited to hear about today in the chat, that can kind of get the conversation rolling as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. And just everyone, that would be great. It helps us if you just say hello, where you're from in the chat. It just kind of helps as an icebreaker, get the conversation started. And while we're doing that, I just want to say, hey, this great people. Let me just Jen, Pasco County Schools, Jackie Coruscani from Marietta College. Awesome.
Oh, great.
Awesome. East Cleveland, Ohio, nifty teacher, Cornella Jordan. Wow, we're in Cleveland.
There you go.
University of Puerto Rico. This is fabulous. Wow. Clint Day. Hey, Clint, glad to see you here.
Awesome.
Carol from Clint. Broward College. We got a lot of fans from Broward College. Yes. Hazleton, Pennsylvania, Launchbox. This is fabulous. And I'm not going to be able to read these. Hi, Lisa. Northwest State, Ohio. Lots of Ohio folks here. Steve, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. I really, really am grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I feel like you're the guy that really made it all happen. Like, entrepreneurship education wasn't a thing before you showed up.
Thank you, Gary. That's very nice.
No, I'm serious, Stephen. It's just such an honor, and I want to start by letting folks know how we connected, and not just logistically how we connected, but more from a kindred spirit connection. So for a long time, Steve, I've been thinking about if you could somehow deconstruct the mindset of entrepreneurs, it could be useful to other people. And that sort of set me on this journey. But I had this weird experience where I wound up taking in a foster kid. His mom's in prison. He's never known a dad. He's been in and out of foster homes all his life. Met him when he was 12, took him in got custody of him at age 16. And I helped him start a little business that had a profound impact on his life. And that's where when I saw the impact on this young man, I really dedicated myself to this space. That was an event. And so what I want to start with is if you can, you've written a number of books, you're now engaged in so many interesting projects. I hope we have a chance to talk about all of them, but take us back to the beginning, and this is kind of outlined in your book, like Goodbye Homeboy. But talk to us about how you got into the entrepreneurship education space to begin with.
Thank you, Gary. First of all, it's great to see you, and I couldn't be happier being here, so it's a real joy to me. I started in our field, which I have been in now 41 years, and love it more now than I ever did, and all the nuances to it and all the value it has. My belief that we're onto something really big that can help people all over the world as we continue to improve and do innovative things as you've done, which I have followed and gotten caught up with recently, and I couldn't be more impressed. So, bravo to you and your team. I grew up in Flint, Michigan. My parents were teachers, and I wanted to be a business person. My goal was to be head of the Ford Motor Company, which is, I love Ford, I love the auto industry, but it'd be the last job I'd want now, let me tell you. When I was a kid, I was homeschooled, and my father was a professor at General Motors Institute in Flint, Michigan, which it was GM's kind of internal school. It's probably the best school in the world. It's the best school in the world for automotive engineering. And so I grew up around journals and auto executives, and I just fell in love with the industry and the entrepreneurial nature of it. And Flint was was so entrepreneurial. Billy Durant, the founder of General Motors, lived half a mile from where I grew up and was a huge inspiration to my life. And a lot of other entrepreneurs that I greatly admired were from that area, and Michigan in general, Kellogg, Upjohn, Stryker, I go on and on. And so I was really interested in business, and I had learning issues. I have had a lifelong, I view it as a blessing, frankly, of dyslexia in particular, where things that are easy for other people are kind of harder for me. And, you know, filing, I've never really been good at that, and skills like that. So I had trouble as a kid, finding my niche where I could make extra money. And there weren't really any jobs because the wage rates were so higher. Flint was actually the highest per capita income in the world for cities under a million people, for 25 years. It was a very wealthy town, but also very gritty, like really gritty. And I'm very proud to be from there. We've had some really tough decades, but I stay in touch with all my friends from my high school and everything. I live in Princeton now, Princeton, New Jersey. So I started getting involved in small business around the age of 10. My neighbor, my best friend of 40 years, was really good at starting paper routes. So I had 7 or 9 businesses where I'd be the number 2 guy, and then he would move on to start a new one, and he'd hand the one that I was working for him to me. And I'd pay him off through weekly payments of revenue. And I went to college and at Michigan, and there wasn't an entrepreneurship program then. That was in 71. I'm 68 and proud of it. And then MBA, and I tried to figure out how to learn about small business. There wasn't really very much there. There was one class, and it was brilliant, by Professor LaRue Hosmer, and I graduated and went to Ford, where I had a comparative advantage in the auto industry because I grew up there. And so the only thing ever came naturally to me was international finance. And I don't know how the brain works, but that was the one thing I was like naturally had an affinity for. And then I was there 3 years, loved it, moved out east, and bizarrely found a business that I was good at, which was sales of overseas manufacturing firms. And the 3rd year, everything was going perfect. And my girlfriend at that time, we went out for a jog together, and I got mugged on the FDR Drive in New York City, where 11th Street, if you take 11th Street right over, I think we met right by there, over into the park, across FDR Drive, broad daylight, 200 people playing soccer, and we got jumped by 4 young people who were probably 12, 13. They were actually smaller than I am, and I'm 5'5". And it wasn't, I slipped, I fell, and it was really embarrassing. And my girlfriend, who were great friends, last 4 to 5 decades or what have you, she saved us. She stepped up, yelled at them, and they ran off. But it was like somehow very humiliating to me to be made to, I thought, look bad in front of my girlfriend. And so the memory stayed in my mind, like post-traumatic stress disorder, even though I wasn't injured, but rather humiliated. The injury was internal, kind of.
Yeah.
And I had this unique friend, Ayn Rand, who was a writer, and my grandfather was her lawyer. And so he introduced me to her. She wrote, Atlas Shrugged, Fountainhead. I think she was the top-selling author of last century in America.
Wow.
And so I could see her once a month for between 5 minutes and 5 hours, depending on how much she wanted to talk.
So wait, let me get this straight. Like, Ayn Rand was your therapist?
No, she was my grandfather was her lawyer.
Okay.
And did her intellectual property work.
Okay.
And this is 1981. She died in March of 82, March 6th. And he introduced me to her because I was familiar with her literature, admired her. I disagreed with her on, some intense topics, but I didn't talk that much, so I let her talk. And I found it really interesting. And she found it somehow, I think, therapeutic to talk because her husband had just died, Frank O'Connor. And she was in great grief. And I was just fascinated, so I just listened. And after I got, this mugging, or, where I messed up in my mind to myself, I had a moment, I think, where I started to talk to myself, which is very indicative of somebody who has, severe or minor PTSD. That's a symptom that kind of goes over the whole tragedy of that, which is a real thing and causing, I think, a lot of these tragic suicides of veterans, which is just heartbreaking. I think it's something like 32 a week. I mean, it is, when you look at the records of it. So she picked up the phone. She said, there's something wrong. What is it? And I said, there's not, because you can't talk about it. That's part of the problem.
Right.
And she picked up the phone and she called this guy named Albert Ellis. Do you remember that name?
I sure do. Rational, REBT, right? Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy.
Yes, exactly. Yep. Very good.
Yeah.
That was the rational. That was a critical book in 83, and they did not agree on politics. He was more of a socialist, and she was a very radical, classical liberal or free market advocate.
Yep.
But she was. I could hear them yelling at each other. They had a bond from Eastern. She came from Russia, and it was brutal. Let me tell you. And you didn't really want to see me on a Sunday, so she forced him to, and I went over there reluctantly, 65th, and.
But you're like a 25-year-old kid, basically.
Yeah.
You got yourself in the middle of Ayn Rand and Albert Ellis. Like that's just unbelievable.
I never thought of it that way. I never thought of it that way. And meanwhile, I'm in denial, going, "There's nothing wrong with me. Don't tell him there's something."
Yeah.
But he really, really helped me, and I don't think I've talked about that this much, but. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think is really common and is underdiagnosed and is a reason for a lot of tragedies, from, dysfunctional relationships to self-medicating, addiction.
Absolutely.
And he made me write down the sentence that was in my brain, which was, you were humiliated by not being able to defend your girlfriend from 12, 13-year-olds that were even much smaller, a male version of the world, where I wasn't acting in the way in my subconscious mind, the way I was supposed to.
Right.
And he goes, okay, you got it. And he goes upstairs, and he has a graduate student who he's told to come over, and he said, you sit with him till he writes out the positive version of that sentence. And I said, well, what's the positive version? And he said, you can figure it out, with Lorraine's help or whatever. But she helped me change it to, you were a hero because in a confrontation between 12 armed, they had little, things that looked like sticks or knives or what have you. No one was injured. You built a team between you and your girlfriend, and it ended very positively. And so by crossing out the negative sentence and putting in the positive, and then writing it 200 times, she let me off after 200. I felt so much better.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I can't tell you.
Steve, let me just dig into that for a second, because, Martin Seligman, who's considered one of the fathers of positive psychology, sort of picked up Ellis's thing and created this. Ellis designed this ABC model, right? There's an adverse event. The B is your beliefs about the event, and C are the emotional consequences. And it's exactly what you just talked about. And Seligman, kind of picked that up to help people dispute irrationally pessimistic beliefs. But the point that I really want to make is, that's what I see in entrepreneurs is the ability to optimistically interpret adversity, which is the underpinnings of grit, of resilience. That's where it comes from. Anyway, I don't want to go off into psychobabble, but I just thought that was super interesting.
I want to say I'm familiar with Seligman's work. I may have mispronounced it, but I think that is critical. I actually think it's really, really important in our field because it deals with risk reward and is inevitably very difficult. There's some years where, through no fault of your own, you don't anticipate the market correctly. That's not your fault. It's things are up and down constantly.
Yeah.
And you get self-blame, you get humiliation, chronic financial stress. And I really think the combining of rational emotive therapy, AB equals C, would help our field really go to a whole nother level.
Oh yeah. Steve, I interviewed a guy in Johannesburg named Frank Magwegwe, who was homeless in South Africa. And homeless in South Africa is a different story from homeless in the United States. And a lady taught him how to sell vegetables on a street corner, and he wound up, teaching at Harvard. I mean, he really. But I asked him in my interview, Steve. I said, you're living in a homeless camp. He was washing his face in a train station, in a bathroom, and I said, what were you telling yourself? How do you keep your spirits alive? And he talked about keeping the demons of despair at bay.
Wow.
By telling himself, I must be good at something. But it's exactly what you're talking about.
Yes.
He was just, and I think it's important for people to understand, entrepreneurial or otherwise, your self-talk matters a lot.
A lot. It's the whole ball game.
It's the whole ball game. It
really is. And you said something very interesting that triggered this thought, because I went back up the next day to thank Albert Ellis, who, I don't know if you've read what he was like, but he was very intense. So he expressed openly exactly what he was thinking with minimal buffer. And
Yeah.
so he was, and it was effective for a lot of people. Some people, it was a little bit too much for, but I got comfortable with it. And I said, I brought you this gift, and I wanted to thank you very, very much. And he looks at me and he throws the gift across the room. I've never seen anybody do that. It was a little, I was like, I thought, oh, did I not pay my bill yesterday? I actually thought that, you know.
Yeah.
And he said, you arrogant, you don't, blah, blah, blah. It was kind of harsh, but I was, you know, trying to be strong. And he said, you've just begun the therapy. And I said, what do you mean? He said, it's going to come back. You haven't flooded it. And so I said, well, I didn't know about that. And he said, well, it's in chapter 7. I don't want to waste time teaching you. This is what you're going to do if you want to see me again.
Yeah.
And he had to report back to Ayn Rand, who then had to report back to my grandfather because he'd introduced her. So they were talking. And so my grandfather had called me and said, well, you know, Albert Ellis, who was also he was an acquaintance of my granddad. There was a kind of a circle of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was a little scary because, you know, I felt like I was under the gun to improve in all areas of my life. It was kind of became, you know, I had these 3 people monitoring me. And so I said, but, you know, I don't want to go. I think I'm okay. Although it did start to come back, which is in all the literature now about post-traumatic stress disorder. They're actually using ecstasy, oddly, at Johns Hopkins to get veterans to talk about their experience. And they're having dramatic results. It's, you know, I've heard it's a huge breakthrough. And they got a special waiver on the drug, you know, to make someone comfortable to talk about what hurt them, you know, recall. And so my granddad said, now, if you don't do what Albert Ellis says as part of your therapy, you're going to make me look bad with Ayn Rand, who's a major client of mine. So it changed the dynamic, you know. So Albert Ellis had said, I want you to find a school where you can teach that has children that come from the same community as the young people that, you know, he didn't use this word, but children that have had a tough go at it, and as such can develop at times, you know, some ways of interacting with other people that can be difficult for both parties, you know. So I said, okay, I'll go. And I started teaching in September of 1981. And then I went, I loved it, boys, girls high school. And then I transitioned full time into the New York City public school system. And the only place I could get a job at that time was in the most difficult school in New York City at that time. It's a much better school now. I'm so proud of how they've done. But Boys and Girls High School, and it had produced many famous business people, basketball players. It was like legendary. But they'd had a lot of violence, including a shooting, and I went there, and you know, I almost from the first day, I thought I'd never wanted to be a teacher before because, you know, I was trying to move up, I think, in my mind from my parents, and then I started to look at it differently. That, you know, my mother would always say, teaching is the highest profession. A great teacher, no, she'd use the word good. She'd say, a good teacher affects eternity. And if you hear that every day, sometimes you don't, you know, it becomes, I think, commonplace. But I remembered it. And so the first day I walked in, I felt this wave of like it was very pleasant to me. I felt I could be a kind of a hero,
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
actually could help other people, that and I really felt good about that. And that was in January of 1982, and I've stayed in the field ever since, and love
That's
it.
but what Albert Ellis was asking you to do is go right into the belly of the beast. Like
Yeah,
turn and face the thing that you were
yeah.
running from is
It's
what he was
called
asking you to.
it's called flooding. Do you remember that
Mm,
word? Where
no.
if you're afraid of something, like I saw anxiety about young kids that uh, looked like they were tough. I don't know any other way to describe it. They may not have been, but in New York, I was one time I was living on 13th Street and Avenue B, and it was a neighborhood of high crime and a lot of tragedies there, And I was walking down the street, and these kids were walking toward me, and I felt this wave of anxiety, like overpowering. And I stepped aside. I must have looked frightened, and one of the kids goes, "Hey, we're not going to hurt you. It's okay." And they all laughed, and it was such
Wow.
a relief. And then I would see them around the neighborhood, and we'd play basketball together. And it was very, I'm very spiritual and think everything happens for a purpose. I really believe that. And I
Yeah.
thought, wow, it really helped me that moment. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is I thought I'd only be there a month. Um, they couldn't get enough teachers, and I thought I'd be there a month until they got more, and then I'd be totally cured and go back to making money.
So but let me make sure I understand this, Steve.
Yeah, sorry.
You had no intention of becoming like pursuing a career in education. You were trying to heal yourself.
Yes.
It was a temporary thing that you just wanted to go through this exercise
Yes.
as something Albert Ellis prescribed,
Yeah,
essentially.
from
And then
my Rand threatening to come over
right,
there and talk to him
right,
directly. Everybody was
right.
scared of her.
Yeah, this story is getting crazier by the minute,
I,
but it's really crazy. But so you think this is going to be a temporary thing, and then like how did it morph into something bigger?
well, there was one critical day. The first 6 weeks, they couldn't get a regular teacher. I was a regular sub. That was what it was called. And a good teacher. So they asked me to stay till they could get a real teacher in there, and it was very difficult. Six weeks. I couldn't control a class. I felt the young men would throw stick bomb or spitballs.
Spitballs.
And
Yeah.
one day, they would use my class because it was special ed, and it's unbelievable that it reminds me kind of some of the things going on now that I didn't know about till yesterday. It's been very upsetting. But when they take kids out of Rikers Island, the drop-off school, if they came out on a Monday or Tuesday morning, would be Boys and Girls High School. Into the special ed department, and I was the lowest ranking, so they bring these children who just got out of Rikers and were, I mean, if you come out of a jail or a prison, it can be from a week to 5 years, you're in some type of trauma. It's really painful. And they hadn't even been home yet. And so they came into my room and were very, didn't really respect me, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of them put bubble gum on my chair, and then another one got the flag. We used to have, haven't been in a school in about a year, but they had flags in the back of the room then, and he got a flag and he was pretending to stab different kids, and then was pretending to stab me, and it got me upset. And then the week before that, same thing had happened, and a child sent. Remember, they're children. These are 16, 15, maybe one or two 17. So people forget that, is that, you know, a high school kid who's in pain and who's acting out, they're still, if they're under 17, 18, they're really just, I mean, I remember myself back then, you know, everything that you're trying to work everything out. I'm amazed at how well they do. They're real heroes to me. But I could barely, we set fire on the kid's coat in the back of the room, which was very serious, and I, you know, made a big deal of it, as I should have. But I wasn't getting better as a teacher, and I could barely stand it. I was really getting discouraged. And the kids that were there who wanted to learn felt, I think, a little bit of contempt toward me for not protecting them from the kids that were more, you know, acting out more. And it was just a really unpleasant time. But one class, I couldn't stand it. So I stepped out in the hall and I literally prayed. I said, God, help, you know, I could barely stand it. But I couldn't leave ethically or even legally, it'd be wrong. And I looked down and I saw my watch and I took it off, and then I pretended I was on Broadway because I'd seen a Broadway play the week before. And I walked in and I go, what would you charge for this? And held up the watch. And the class went stone cold silent. It was, it became like a you know, a PhD seminar on trade cycle theory or something. And I was smart enough to know to just write the answers on the board and let them interact. And for the next 25 minutes, it got onto watches, what you'd pay for them. Kids were holding up their watch to show why their watch was more or less value. And I just let the class run. And then I didn't, at that time, I didn't realize what a breakthrough that was for me. And I ended up staying the whole term because they couldn't get anyone to come to Boys and Girls High. In fact, they were planning on closing it. There were a lot of cover stories on the New York Post, and everybody was worried, including me, because, you know, I wanted to feel part of the team. Even if I was planning on leaving, I wanted them to do well. And the last day of class, I invited, you know, all the kids for a pizza party after school. And I said, why were you so difficult? And what, do you not respect me? Or, and, you know, they told the truth, that the class was so boring, because I went back to teaching from the regular lesson plans.
Right.
And we could barely stand it, and that's why we'd act out. They actually used that language. And I said, well, was there ever a time where you enjoyed it? And this kid named Edwin Blanding, he said, Mr. Mariotti, there was just one day where I got into it, and that was the day on the watch.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Steve, you know, I had the exact same, a very, very similar experience. And after I taught this young kid a foster kid that I took in, I was asked to teach entrepreneurship in a local high school as a volunteer with another entrepreneur friend of mine, which is why I went to Washington, D.C. to take the NFTE course in June of 2006, where you and I first met. I didn't have a framework to teach entrepreneurship, but I did the same thing. I basically started to engage kids in similar conversations, like, what are you interested in? How can you make yourself useful with the things that you're interested in? right?
Yes.
And it was the same thing. And one of the kids got kicked out of the school about halfway through for smoking weed or something. And another one of the students like met up with him 2 or 3 years later, like in Los Angeles, and said that class about entrepreneurship was the most impactful class I ever took in high school.
Isn't that great joy? Isn't that, is there any greater joy than that?
There's no greater joy than that. But it's like, you know, again, like you and I, this is where we're kindred spirits. And what you and I are both trying to articulate to the world is that exposure to entrepreneurial principles, which I describe as self-directed value creation,
I like that.
Creates a really powerful incentive to learn. And that's what that's what we're trying to do. That's the work you and I are trying to do to get into schools to help educate, understand that you want to, you know, Jaime Casap from Google Education, I hijacked this saying from him, but stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up and start asking them what problems they want to solve and what do they need to learn in order to solve those problems.
Wow, a very good insight. That's beautiful.
Right.
Insight.
That's how we shift the locus of control. But anyway,
which is critical. Locus of control.
It's everything. It's everything.
Yeah, we did a bunch of research on that, which is on Nifty's website. So thank you for mentioning those words.
Well, I think that's it, Steve. My area of interest is in the mindset of the entrepreneur. What are the underlying beliefs and assumptions that give rise to the behavior? And I don't think people are fully aware of the ways in which we set foot in school and we learn to assume that someone else has figured out what we need to learn and do in order to be successful in life.
Very good point.
Right. And then so we step out into the world, and if there's no one there to tell us what to learn and do, we're kind of helpless.
Yes.
And I think the difference between the entrepreneurial mindset and the non-entrepreneurial mindset is in the locus of control. It's up to me to figure out how to make myself useful to other humans, as opposed to someone else is going to tell me how to be useful to other humans.
Well said.
It's just that straightforward. So you had this aha moment with the watch, and watching the kids go from being disruptive and disengaged to being much, much more engaged. So, I mean, Steve, there's no way we're going to get through this in an hour and a half. We're going to have to do a part 2 of this interview.
I was thinking maybe part 50 on TV.
Right?
Poor Nick, your right-hand person. We talked for 2.5 hours.
I'm going to put you on the spot right now and
bring it on. I'm ready.
That's what we have to do. But so like, how did that experience, like that sort of aha moment, like how did that lead to Nifty?
Yeah, there was one insight from listening where I realized that most of the young people did not know there was any price other than retail. And that for me was life-changing. It never occurred to me that young people, I never thought that thought before, that knowing there's a production structure, manufacturing, wholesale, retail, and jobbers and all the different parts of it, is critical for wealth creation. And I had studied with Hayek, who won the Nobel, 1974. Do you remember F.A. Hayek?
Yeah.
My specialty was trade cycle theory. And I was like, it fit into international finance kind of. It actually fit in very much. And so I had written a paper which was published that Hayek had noticed, and I got a scholarship to study for a summer out at the Institute for Humane Studies, and was his driver. And I arranged it so my office was next door to his, and so I'd come out when he was in the office, and his desk was facing, and I kind of talk real loud and walk by pretending I wasn't, I was searching for a mentor.
Yeah.
But we have lunch with 10 of us every day. But I read all of his literature, and in the use of knowledge in society is an article he published on the cover of the American Economic Review, which is the top, at that time, the top economic journal. Do you remember his book, The Road to Serfdom?
No, not familiar.
It's worth taking a look at, or Wikipedia, and just quick review.
Yeah.
It was a seminal book, I thought. But that article I'd read in undergraduate, and there were two paragraphs in it, paragraphs 10 and 11. And basically, he argues that every human being has, thank you, Nicole, every human being has a niche. And he called it a comparative knowledge of time and place.
Mm.
Of time and place. And he argued that was what the key thing the entrepreneur was able to get good at what problem to solve at time and in what place, at what time and
Right.
what place. And that was a huge breakthrough for me. And then years later, I used it when the young person said to me, the only time I ever learned anything in your class, the ultimate teacher nightmare, when there was only one time, but
yeah.
It was life changing for me. And about 20 years ago, I met up with all those kids. I found all but four, and I thanked them, and we went out to a wonderful lunch. But that was life changing for me, because I realized then that they weren't learning that. I just assumed everybody knew. The big mistake I've made in my life as a teacher, and I've seen other teachers make it as well, is assumption of knowledge. You start to assume that what you know, everybody knows, and it's a huge error in education.
Yeah.
And you can't, it goes against the concept of, a lot of people go into teaching. I think part of the reason I stayed so long and will always be here is sometimes I have a need, almost a therapeutic need, to talk. And and I think that a lot of people go into teaching, and I'm not being critical. It's good, but I think we need to be aware of it. That there are certain things you can't learn unless you listen. And my parents would always tell me that, Steve, when you're speaking, you know what you think, but if you listen, you're learning what other people think. And that was a very hard thing for me to learn, even today, as you can tell. But that gave me a vision where I could have this fulfillment of I felt every day for the last 41 years actually, of doing something of importance. And some of my friends, a lot of my friends, frankly, from business school, made a lot of money. My roommate in graduate school made, it's been widely written about, like over $500 million, and I really admire him. And he said, Steve, if I had to do it over again, I would have had your career.
Yeah. That's something, Steve, I have this theory that when a human being is able to pursue his or her interests and develop his or her abilities in ways that benefit other humans, like, we become optimally engaged. And that we all try to seek happiness by making money, and it doesn't really work. It's
And I jump in there because there's actually a question that I know where you could go with that point, Gary. So let's
Yeah,
go
of course.
there.
Yeah.
Clint asked about 15 minutes ago, loving the CBT, the Ellis conversation. How does that align with Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, and how does that fit into entrepreneurship? And I think that's where some of the optimal engagement type of conversation could take us. So do you mind speaking on that, Gary? And Steve would
No, I'm happy to, and Steve chime in. So part of my theory is that and I'm going to try to provide a little bit of runway here, but for most of the world, we tend to default to trait-based assumptions about entrepreneurs, that they're somehow just born with these traits and everyone else is destined to be an employee. And that's, in psychology, we call that a fundamental attribution error. And we tend to attribute a person's behavior to their traits while ignoring the cognitive, motivational, and situational factors that are non-obvious, but they're exerting enormous influence on the person. And so with that as sort of my runway, my theory is that the goal, the compelling nature of the goal being pursued acts on the individual. Like Bruce Lee said, Bruce Lee said something to the effect of that the successful warrior is nothing more than a common man with a laser focus.
Wow.
In my theory, the successful entrepreneur is nothing more than a common person with a compelling goal.
Wow.
And now there's a whole field of emerging psychology around this, and which fits into Csikszentmihalyi's work of flow, that we become autotelic is the word that Csikszentmihalyi uses.
Wow.
And when you're autotelic, you're being like irresistibly compelled. The goal is acting on you. And the field of prospection theory that's charged by Martin Seligman and others validates this. When we're pursuing something that's compelling to us, our brains are able to access unprecedented problem-solving abilities that are not otherwise available to us when we're engaged in more routinized behavior. So that's where it fits with the Csikszentmihalyi stuff in my work. If you look up the definition of autotelic, that's it. Like you're just there's a focus, and the goal is pulling you into the future. You're no longer trapped by the task, right? That's
the
present.
Or the
yes.
present. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a fascinating paper that Seligman and his colleagues wrote, and it's called something about the past, navigating the future, or trapped in the past.
I'll get the link. That was close.
Yeah, it wasn't quite accurate, but it speaks to that a question. But and thank you for the question, Clint. But I want to, I still want to get to, and we're time. I want to start having folks chime in here, and I know we've got a lot of comments and questions. But there's one thing that I noticed, Steve, and I still want to hear how this turned into nifty. Like you turned this into something that, was greater than you. And I also want to ask you about that, but also about and you've written about this in Goodbye Homeboy, like what I call like the academic antibodies that descended upon you and tried to kill you. Right. That they don't want you talking about money with students. Like, I mean,
it was against the law at that time. I don't know if it still is, but teacher couldn't show money. I mean, it was bizarre. I thought I was in the Soviet Union or something. And you couldn't teach it. It was like really weird. But I spent 8 years, practicing, trying to get better. I was very motivated. I'm so glad that someone cited me the literature there. Thank you. And I'm going to learn about your work, more about these are great insights. For me, I was at that time trying to look for a teaching style and a way that I could contextualize I guess that means organize, these lessons that I was developing every day at the end of the day at a restaurant called Eddie's in right, it was an NYU hangout. And I just, I was getting, people liked me, but it was too much for some schools. And so at the end of the term, I would be the guy last hired, first fired. I was that guy. And so by just chance, I ended up in the South Bronx, and my mentor and my role model was a woman named Patricia Black, who just died last weekend. And the minute I met her in '87, I went on an interview. You had to interview at the school. And, I'd been in special ed departments, which were the best place for me, or in the typing department, which it was the worst place for me. And but she really took a liking to me. And after a couple difficult semesters, I with her permission, my real hero at that time, and still is, I think the greatest teacher of the last century, in my opinion, at the high school level, was Jaime Escalante. Do you remember him?
No.
They made the movie Stand and Deliver.
Oh, yeah.
that was and so I would call him and call him and call him, and the phone would ring and ring and ring, because back then there was no answering machines, no cell phone.
Right.
You couldn't reach anybody. It was like
Right.
Who would call me back all the time was Richard Feynman, won the Nobel in '61. So anybody I admired, I had no sense of hierarchy, which is a really good thing. And I got that from these kids. They weren't intimidated they didn't know you weren't supposed to call the CEO. There was no sense of that. That's a huge advantage. So, do you remember Richard Feynman?
Yeah.
He called me, picked up the phone, and he goes, "I have been trying to reach you and return your call for a month." And he was the most famous physicist. And where I moved to Princeton in honor of him and his kindness to me. But I finally got through to Jaime Escalante, and I said, "I really admire you, and want to learn from what I've read about you." And he said, "Well, can you come out tomorrow to Garfield High in East LA?" And I said, "You mean tomorrow?" And he goes, "Yeah. Why don't you come out tomorrow and you can stay with my family and I. We have a pull-out bed in the kitchen." It was what it was. And I said, "Wow, let me call my principal and ask her if I can do that." And Pat Black she said, "Yes, that's a world-class opportunity for you and for us." And so the next day I flew out to LA and found my way to Garfield High. And he was from Peru, and he came here when he was 48, and they wouldn't let him teach. So he washed dishes at a restaurant for 6 years, and at night had to redo his math degree. All the stuff you have to redo. It's a real tragedy, I think. And he didn't start teaching till age 52, in America. And he was so kind to me. When they started to film, just coincidentally, they were starting the movie, and I was still there. And so his wife, very nice wife, said, "Steve, there's a very small hotel down the street," because it was too much with the movie and me in the kitchen, but it was one of the happiest times of my life. And his teaching ability, and he took a class in Garfield High, which was, at that time, it's much better now, but it was like it was an under-resourced community with a lot of pain because of poverty. And he took a class that was supposed to be 8th grade math. You repeated earlier math. And he, in 18 months, had 2 national champions in what at that time was the national math competition. He beat Exeter, all these fancy private schools. And the movie is true to life. After he won, I think, 4 national championships, they couldn't believe it, right? So they thought somehow the kids were cheating. Can you imagine?
Steve, I got to go back and watch that movie, but I'm so excited to talk to you about this. And I think another place where you and I are kindred spirits is what this story demonstrates is that we're massively miscalculating the capability of challenged people or marginalized people.
That's it.
Young people. I mean, it's and when you put them in a different context, they behave differently. And that's what that story, I mean, that's what NFTE is all about, right?
That's right.
We're just, school kind of spits these kids out. If they're not academic rock stars, it just kind of, spits these kids out. And there's a whole sea of untapped potential that we're overlooking,
Right.
that we can't get to in this current way of thinking. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's
No, I appreciate it. I'm learning a lot, and I really appreciate it. What I learned during this time period out in Jaime's class, and the last day, have you ever had moments of pure joy in life?
Yes.
I wish it could be every day, but it's not. But he takes me out to lunch my last day, and I'm sad actually because I thought I was witnessing a genius, Michelangelo, in our field, and I was just really pumped, to go back and be a better teacher and try to get a book of lesson plans and a curriculum, because he was really organized by topic and everything, but he never published, which I thought was sad. He did after he left Garfield, actually, but the key thing that I learned there was that, and I would begin every one of my classes for the next, I taught another 10 years. I taught full time for 7 years while we were starting NFTE. And is that the young person, I use the word child so that I don't forget that they're under 18. That they're still, you got to be real careful on field trips and they have to feel how I was able to feel. They have to feel they're heroes. So I'd start every class with having them write privately. I said, I'll never ask you to read or to share anything that's personal. So you can write with full privacy. But I found that every kid, once they were relaxed, they then could share, kind of therapeutic. But I would say, write about all that you've overcome to get here today.
Wow.
And then they'd feel like I did when I was getting well with Alice's help, the fear of Ayn Rand, and with my granddad grading me,
Steve, you know where I heard that story before? Rodney Walker. With his mentor, whose name escapes me right now, it'll come to me in a minute, but Rodney told me
I know it is,
the Mr. McGrone, Michael McGrone. Michael McGrone took him in, and Rodney kind of woke up when he took the NFTE course.
In Chicago.
And Rodney told me that he said, I can apply this entrepreneurial mindset to learning.
That's right.
But he told me, Steve, that Michael McGrone asked him to sit down with a pad and a pen and write a letter to God. Like, what
Wow.
have you been through? Like all this trauma, just write it all down. And he took it outside and put it in a metal bucket and lit it on fire. And Rodney said it was like a transformational moment for him.
He was homeless at that time
Yeah, he
before
was
he went to
homeless.
Morehouse.
Yep.
He and I have the same birthday. And I think
Wow.
that's my claim to fame.
Yeah.
That young man, that's where we last saw each other, was at his wedding.
Yeah, and now he's got a little baby boy, little Clark, right? Little Clark Walker.
I didn't know. That's
Yeah,
great. I got a call.
yeah. But the other thing, Steve, I mean, I'm extrapolating this from your story, but you had this experience with the watch and you started talking about commerce basically. And you said something in your book that I thought was also interesting, that like you realized that these kids, they saw no connection between school as a path to improving their lives. Like they
Yes.
just, that just wasn't clear to them until you started talking about, for lack of a better word, economics or commerce or entrepreneurship, whatever it was with the watch.
Yes, and also the importance of time and place. In other words, the production structure is what the product goes through to finally be sold and used by the consumer. But it starts way back in time. So whenever you buy something, behind it is a whole time period. It could be 10 years when you count the inventions and everything, the capital goods that go into it. All along that time travel, where the product's produced and put together and it's made better and comes down, is thousands, if not tens of thousands of opportunities to make a livelihood, often doing something that you enjoy. That production structure is critical to.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think our field at times could do. It would be cool if if that concept. If I had one wish, it would be that everybody read those chapters 10 and 11 in Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society. They're very hard to read. He overwrote a lot, but he had the old German. It's beautiful when you can. It's very structured and it's beautiful when you learn it. But when it's translated into English, it can come across as a little heavy. But the other insight I had then, and I wish I'd built more of my career around it. I kind of underestimated the power of it. Is the power of ownership, because ultimately ownership is who makes the decisions often, and locus of control ultimately can go back to the owner. The owner can hire the entrepreneur. So I was always entrepreneurship. The ownership is a pathway to prosperity or achieving your goals. If I had my career to do over again, I might have promoted the concept of owner equal to entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship being a tactic, skill, or strategy to fulfill your ownership over your time, place, and a locus of control, self-esteem. Because I've seen that many times where somebody is very gifted in entrepreneurship, but they end up, the benefits to it go to a owner, somebody who knows how to do the paperwork, raise the capital from a bank, and then own the part of the structure of production. And you become another part of the resources. And I'm not being critical or judgmental, but if students, if they can learn the concept of ownership and entrepreneurship, does that make sense, or is that?
Steve, I mean, I love that you're just giving me such joy in this conversation. I served on the board of the Dean's Council at the Polytechnic School at Purdue,
My uncle's went to Purdue.
And these guys and these academics are saying, like, I love your work, but stop talking about entrepreneurship. Just talk about innovation.
Mm.
And I'm saying no. Like the innovation to me is the problem finding and problem solving component. But the advocacy of the idea is the entrepreneurial component. And I'm not interested in just training people how to be more productive for their employer. I want people to have the agency to be able to, I think of it like this, Steve, like, first and foremost, you've got to make yourself useful to other humans. You've got to, it's not really about you, but you've got to bring this idea to life in a way that benefits others, but it's also got to benefit you. I mean, that's kind of that's that sweet spot.
Otherwise,
that's how I think.
It's not sustainable if you don't.
It's sort of like it. But there's another component of this I've been thinking about, Steve, is that when people think of entrepreneurship education or the benefits of entrepreneurship education, we tend to think of it as strictly as economic. And the data is quite clear there that it's very impactful. The economic impact of entrepreneurship education is not controversial. But I think, to your earlier point, Steve, that we tend to ignore the developmental benefits of the individual. The creativity, the critical thinking, the resilience, the resourcefulness, the agility, the problem finding, all those things. And I don't know what you think about this, but I'd love to hear it. I'm advocating in our work, Steve, that one should focus on the developmental benefits and the economic will take care of themselves. It's almost the antithesis of Taylorism, where you're just trying to squeeze as much lemon juice out of the lemon as you possibly can. I'm saying, like, take the opposite effect and invest in the lemon.
I see that. I love your language. It's powerful. And I really appreciate your use of the word agency in that, because that's critical. The feeling
it is critical
of being in charge of your future time, that you're going to influence by what you do now, what happens in the future, is such empowerment. I mean,
that's it, Steve. That's the whole enchilada.
Yeah,
right.
I agree.
The literature is actually quite clear on this, which I find very interesting, Steve. That your sense of agency is actually more important than your actual agency.
It's the whole ballgame, right? Because value is subjective. Value is subjective. So.
Yeah. So, Steve, I mean, we're going to go on forever here. Nick, I want to make sure that you feel, there's questions in here, there's comments. I'm trying to.
There's so many comments, I couldn't even begin to get into those, but there's a really good meaty question that I wanted to get both of your thoughts on that might lead to some other questions. And that is from Miss Jordan. I believe she just stepped out. She sent me an email saying, thank you for this presentation. But she said, how do we get school district superintendents and boards of education to understand this, that is entrepreneurship education, and move forward on implementing entrepreneurship education? So how do we attack those antibodies and convince them that we're meant to be here? What's the organ transfer drug that we need to give to the education?
I think Gary will go first on this one because that's
we recently published a white paper, and Nick, I would hope maybe you could put a link to it in there, called the Entrepreneurial Mindset Imperative.
Oh, I'd love to.
And Steve, I'll make sure we send you a copy, but Nick will put it in the show notes.
I'll put it in the chat and in the script.
Because that's really where my work, my part of Eli, that's my role in the organization. But Steve, you wrote a whole book about this. The Entrepreneur Manifesto, which is really, that's what that was about. And so I want to make sure you have the floor here to talk about that.
Well, thank you very much. I do want to say that, I've worked on that book so hard. And have you ever done, if what you thought was of value, but you add too much to it because you're so, and
Steve, stop. I'm at the end of 7 years for writing a book, and what you're saying is strikes at the heart of my of just my worst fear.
I know it's
It's the worst.
painful. And whenever I would do the right thing and try to make it a short, readable, 30-page thing, like I was trying to do a counter to Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, and as supplement to Louis Kelso's The Capitalist Manifesto, which I urge everybody to read, 1958. I mean, and my class and I were fortunate enough to, thanks to Ray Chambers, a great philanthropist here in New Jersey, to go out and meet with Louis Kelso, who had developed the ESOPs. You're familiar with ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans? They're a big deal in corporate America, where the workers end up owning a majority of the company. And they've been very successful. There are some issues, but they've been very successful. And Kelso created that and influenced the tax code so that it benefited the owners to set up ESOPs, because then dividends could be deducted from their earnings. And it really revolutionized American business. And his whole life was spent struggling with, how do you create a role, how do you get people that are working for you or a huge organization to also feel the sense of ownership, even though they're not in the corporate boardroom, they didn't get the paperwork originally, etc., etc., etc. Ownership's tricky, You can be the most productive person on the team. And you know who really helped me with getting my thinking organized was a reading about Oprah Winfrey, who is she's I'm a huge fan of hers, and she was making $1 million a year, and she was the star of this show that everybody watched before it was called Oprah. And she goes in to renegotiate her contract, and her lawyer is with her, and he comes out and he says, well, great news, perfect, they're going to raise it to 1.1 million a year. And she didn't say anything. She said, oh, great. And they're walking out, and everybody's coming up to her and going, wow, your lawyer is so nice, we love him. And then she goes home, brilliant description, and she's sitting there and she goes, he's nice, why were they saying that? And the next day she recreated her business side and got a different mean lawyer who went in and asked for half the ownership and way more, potential profit. See, workers don't get the advantage of the price earnings ratio. They get their compensation based on really a year, on a time frame.
Right.
Owners, when they sell, get a multiple of earnings.
Yeah.
Do you see the power of that? And I knew that, but when I read the Oprah, I've read everything ever written about her, and wrote her fan letters, and was scheduled to be on the show right before she decided to. I was a green story, which means forever green, that you can use it, so. But I was so happy just to have met her through her Stedman Graham, who's a very good writer. That was her boyfriend back then.
Yep.
Wonderful man. He was on our board at NFTE.
Yep.
I'm so glad to have a chance to talk. I can't remember what your question was.
Well, the question was like, how do we get academic influential people in academia to embrace these ideas? And the one point I want to add to the question, before you answer, Steve, is I'm constantly amazed when you look at just the economic benefits of entrepreneurship. Set aside the developmental, just the economic. I have to scratch my head at why isn't this in every grade from kindergarten through 12?
You can imagine how I feel after 42 years. It's heartbreaking. It really is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's sad. My worry, not my worry, the opportunity to turn it to a positive is, our teachers have not often had the chance you could be the top teacher in the world in second grade reading. And I mentioned second grade reading because they build prisons based on second grade reading scores. Did you know that?
Right.
I mean, think of that. They actually look at the second grade reading levels in neighborhoods and they go, well, we'll project out the crime rate and this is how many young people will end up going to prison. It so angered me because then I thought, well, wonder if you had the best second grade reading levels, teachers, and you got them with these 600 schools. Most of the dropouts come from 600 high schools out of 19,000. Right. Think of that, just 600. So you could close those, redesign them, or get the best teachers in the country there, and you dramatically drop this tragedy of dropouts. Most kids drop out after they fail algebra because there's not a pathway often to retake it where it's viewed as a positive. And that one thing, because I'll tell you, our field impacts math thinking as much as anything else that I've ever seen. That's what Jaime taught me. He said, what you're doing is very important because it can take the mathematics both down to elementary, junior high, and it can take it forward. He was essentially a math teacher. And so we really bonded over that intersection. I have struggled with that. And Mike Caslin, who's been, my close dear friend, and I always hired up. I saw a couple of nifty people around here, but anyone that came to Nifty was always a little bit smarter, more adjusted, because that's how you build an organization. You want to get the best and the brightest, and I really feel we were really good at that. But he was really the key person in thinking about how to win over the school systems, and it basically came down to research. So we did a ton of research, but even with that, there was some, and if somebody could figure that out, because it's sometimes I feel it is the most underutilized idea concept, and we've gotten so much better at it the last 40 years. It's hard to say that it's just and you know what is for Nifty, I apologize, I'm having trouble turning off my cell phone. Nifty's in 17 countries, I think. I really apologize. And our largest country, get this, it's just unbelievable to me, for graduates is, I won't torture you. Do you want to take one guess and then I'll tell you? So I know it's torture to guess. Our youth entrepreneurship program. We've got a great CEO that's running Nifty, and he's done a great job. It's China.
Wow.
Which has a communist government. That's our number one country for graduates.
That's so frightening.
I know.
It's terrifying.
Terrifying.
I've seen this. Steve, I'm doing some consulting work for the Department of Education in South Africa. They're putting entrepreneurial mindset in the whole K-12 curriculum.
Bravo.
We're going to get beat
Nice.
at our own game.
I know.
I mean, you know, but now I just want to come back around to the sunny side of this for a moment.
Yeah, me too.
We go nihilistic here. But I think like that Eli, like our strategy, what we finally figured out is that, you know, we've trained about 3,000 educators around the globe.
Oh, nice.
And you know, some percentage of them are adopting the Ice House curriculum, but a lot of teachers are coming just for the professional development. And so we decided to embrace that. You know, we have some tools you can use.
Yep.
But Steve, another way to come about this, and I feel like you and I should spend more time together, that we could collaborate on this question, the solution to this. But the Eli strategy is essentially Trojan horse. Like, we infect the teacher with these ideas. The teacher becomes impassioned because the teacher's been alienated also, just as the student is. And so our strategy is to empower the teacher with the tools to infuse entrepreneurial thinking into the classroom in an interdisciplinary way.
Yeah.
You know, I like to say entrepreneurship education is non-denominational.
Right. Yes.
Right. It's interdisciplinary.
Unitarian.
It's Unitarian. Steve, don't tell me you're Unitarian, because I was raised in a Unitarian church.
Me too.
Right. Oh boy.
Where the founding of the SDS was.
That's what. So we could go up in a whole rabbit hole.
Yeah, let's not do that.
What was the liberal religious use, the LRY?
Yes.
Right?
Carl Oglesby. I apologize.
Yeah.
I apologize, Gary, but I gotta say this. Carl Oglesby, who became a legendary political figure in the 60s and wrote Raven in the Storm, which has a lot of implications for our field. It was the my head of our Unitarian youth group, and became president of the SDS for 3 years because he took all of us 13-year-olds to the national conference, and we could vote for whoever we wanted. And so we all voted for our 30-year-old church group leader.
Wow. Small world.
Small world, right? I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's good. It's good. But Nick, I want to make sure that there's that we can address some other questions.
Yeah, well, this is a simple one. Steve, you mentioned a piece that you read about Oprah, and we had some folks wondering about if you had a title for that or anything.
I have a huge book collection. I won't say how many books. It shocks everybody. I told Nick in confidence.
Yes.
But there is so much written on Oprah if you Google it. Although I must say, my favorite book on business is Why Should White Guys Have All the Fun? And it's by a biography of Reginald Lewis. It's actually an autobiography. And I happen to be I'm very good friends with his widow. Tragically, he died. And that book, I mean, is phenomenal. And he knew Oprah, and there's so much good material on Oprah that you could just Google it, and almost anything that has a good title I'd read. That's what I did.
Okay. No, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I had a few, and they just keep coming, people saying yes or thank you or asking for quotes. And I've put this in the chat a couple times, but I do want to highlight that we are recording this, and we'll be sending the recording out typically within 24 hours of the event. So you can feel free to rewatch at your leisure. But it's also great to hear so many nifty folks and so many Ice House facilitators who are on this call. It's really
all right, team.
You all are doing the work of shifting the mindset of schools.
Nick, I apologize. There is one thing that has, and it's very, very positive, but I want to say it so that we can hear it, because I didn't really see it, and I definitely feel, without getting into any over discussions of where we are today as a country or anything, But I'll tell you, if I could wish for one thing right now, would be universal business economic financial literacy, because if somebody, no matter how good of a person they are or well intentioned, if they're making policy decisions in other fields like government or what have you, and they haven't really pushed the concept to the end of the pin, where they've really learned the value of an income statement, and that there's really nothing for free, shucks, but it would make a better world for everybody.
Steve, I want to pile in there. The two things I want to say. The most impactful thing that I learned from my NFTE training is unit economics.
Oh, yeah.
And I still remember it. I mean, and you said how important it is. I got to tell you something, Steve. There's a lot of college-educated adults walking around that don't understand unit economics.
It's the number one cause of poverty in the world, is my latest thinking.
I 100% agree.
India, when you land in India, we landed at night. The driver, I said, we've got to stop. We're going to walk in. We didn't do that, but he almost hit at least 80, for some reason, men that were sleeping out on the field. And I was so upset about it that I went back the next day with my friend who invited me over and is a professor there still. And he designed a research, and he had his assistant with him, so it worked pretty well. But we interviewed 40 people that day who were homeless. And at least 30 of them, 32 actually, had started a business with their savings or their family's savings, and had gone, were not successful. And I then piled on with this interest that I have, energy I have around the economics of one unit. Because once somebody learns that, I think their chances for success soar. You could eliminate
100%.
32 out of the sample size cited their going out of business as being why they were homeless. I mean, it's a tearjerker. And my thinking is, every single one of them could not define their economics of one unit. That was my value to the research.
Yeah. But so I want to use that to answer the earlier question, Steve. And I feel like if you and I could collaborate, we might be able to make a bigger dent in the education universe. But I think part of the answer to the question that was asked about how do we, essentially how do we infiltrate the education universe? I think, Steve, part of the answer is that we have to disentangle entrepreneurial attitudes and skills from managerial.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Right, and because
totally.
My friends in South Africa say this: when you mention entrepreneurship, the English teacher gets up to go make tea. Right? I mean that's. They think it's all about business and making money, and people think it's not. There's just no place in education or whatever. Regardless.
I know.
But what we were able to do in our work, Steve, is sort of separate those two things.
That's smart.
The attitudes and skills required to discover opportunities are distinct from the attitudes and skills required to exploit that opportunity.
Wow, nice.
And I think that's what the entrepreneurial skills are, the soft skills that employers are demanding.
I know.
But if you just can't. If we have to.
There's a book right there, Gary. That's powerful language. You've had some really. You've got a book right there. I own half of a publishing firm now. So
let's talk about that, because I just finished the first draft of a 7-year writing project, and that I would love to talk to you about. About the entrepreneurial mindset, and I'm interested in the origins and evolution of the entrepreneurial mindset. How can we cultivate this in ourselves and others? But We're out of time.
Oh.
Nick, do we have any time? We have time for one last question. I want to be respectful.
I mean, yes, we can be respectful of everyone's time. It is another meaty one. So,
Steve, I just want to call you out for a minute because you asked the same question that Dr. Tony Wagner asked on this series, which was, I think 90 minutes is too much. And here we are at 90 minutes.
That's right.
We're going to have to cut people off.
Right.
Just getting started, right?
Yeah. No, it's been wonderful. And, you know, someone said opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is cost. And, you know, it's always good to end a little early. That was vaudeville's message, to leave them wanting more.
Yes.
Yeah. To leave.
So don't overstay your welcome is what.
Yeah. That's the French idea. You should leave the table a little bit hungry.
That's right.
Right.
But I never obeyed that when I was in France.
Right.
Hard to with all that butter.
Yeah. So, Steve, I just want to thank you for this has been such a joy for me. I have the utmost respect for what you've done, and you know, you're one of my personal heroes. So for me to have this conversation with you is just incredibly humbling. It's an incredible source of joy, and I hope to continue the conversation.
Me too. We'll give everybody a rest for a little bit and then sneak back in. I do want to leave on this part, if it's helpful. We were in South Africa for, I think, 12 years, and there was a gentleman over there named Tabby who runs a huge school in Johannesburg. And I went there. I couldn't believe it. There were like 40,000 young people there in college. So if that's helpful, I still have a lot of contacts. And if you're interested in raising money to help, I've got all of, I know a lot of people from South Africa who have done really well in business, and they think about it all the time and are struggling with how to, so they might be very helpful to you. Anybody I know, you and everybody else on the call knows, I love helping people. It's a great joy. So I'm in your corner, and thank you, Nick, for helping me get organized. Oh my God.
Steve.
Gary, I enjoyed this. You know, I'm a little significantly older, I think, probably than anybody here, and proud of it, you know. But I've seen people younger than I am become, I don't mean to embarrass you, but like really geniuses, I think. I know all the top people in the world in this field, this niche. You better after 40 years, let me tell you. But it gives validity to my life. And it's pure joy. So I really am flattered, and thank you. And thank you to everybody who is here. It's wonderful hour and a half.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Love you. Love what you're doing. We're going to have this conversation. We're going to keep going.
Love you. Love what you're doing. So I guess goodbye.
Yes. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank
you.
Bye.
Thanks, Nick.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Steve.
Everybody.
Thank you, everyone.